Good evening and very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden, the director of the school, and it's a huge pleasure this evening to introduce Diane Coyle. As you know, the school works on trying to understand and manage the big challenges of the 21st century, and amongst the many big challenges is an understanding of how economics works. If we could master that, we could solve many global problems. But not many people can, and we're very fortunate to have with us this evening someone who's provided not only analytical rigor, but clarity as well in her ability to think through the issues and help us understand better economics. Diane has a doctorate from Harvard University and has been working over many years in different settings, in government, in treasury, as a member of the Migration Advisory Committee, the Competition Commission, an Economist magazine, as the economics editor of The Independent, and as an author and as a professor at Manchester University. She's been given the OBE for her services to economics. She's worked in media, has been a BBC Trustee, and many of you might have heard her on the radio or elsewhere giving clarity to economic analysis. Her new book, GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History, which will be on sale for the remarkably cheap price of £7.50 afterwards, has been acclaimed by many commentators from academia and well beyond as a very rare, concise introduction not only to GDP, but for all the questions of how one measures and how one should measure economic activity. The core project, which is a project which we started here in INET together with a group of people on trying to write a better economics curriculum, has been advancing, and Diane has also been a key member of that and is writing a number of the modules. So her book, GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History, follows from her previous book, The Economics of Enough, How to Run the Economy as If the Future Matters, which indeed has become as well the slogan of CORE, how to do economics as if the future matters. So a very, very busy person involved in many areas, including consultancy through her Enlightenment Economics, but someone who is always available, I've found, when economists need clarity. Diane, it's a great pleasure to have you here. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Who would have thought that GDP could interest a room full of people? In fact, when my publisher said to me, must be 2 or 3 years ago now, I think there's a market for a general interest book about gross domestic product, I thought he must be deranged. But I know of somebody called Andreas Georgiou, who was until recently the head of the statistical agency in Greece. And he was brought into that job by the International Monetary Fund and the European Union when the first bailout of Greece started a few years ago. The reason being that the numbers for the Greek economy, the deficit figures, the GDP figures, had been literally made up before, to the extent that the official European Union statisticians wouldn't accept them as valid. Now, unfortunately, the fact they were made up didn't stop the international investment banks from lending money to Greece on the basis of these figures. But the lenders in the bailout were determined that Greece was going to have proper statistics for the first time in many years. So they brought in Mr. Georgiou, a very eminent economist, and he replaced the board of directors and reformed the statistical agency. And the previous board of directors promptly accused him of treason. And that court case has rolled on through the Greek courts until just recently, when the case was finally dismissed. And when it was dismissed, he resigned. I think it was a pretty tough job all those years. And his successor is now being appointed, again on the insistence of the international lenders, the EU and the IMF, by a panel of international statisticians and not at all by Greek politicians. And in fact, those interviews by the eminent international statisticians were taking place in Athens last week. The deficit GDP ratio was key to that story, those economic statistics, and there are quite a lot of what are called administrative uses of these economic statistics these days. Another recent example was on the 30th of December, Argentina's new finance minister and new national statistician announced a national statistical emergency. You can imagine my excitement when I read that such a thing was possible. And they have closed down the publication of government statistics until they can sort them out and make them accurate. And again, this is linked to international loans. There are political and legal consequences of whatever the numbers turn out to say. And they're not going to start publishing official statistics in Argentina again until September, because that's how long he thinks it will take him to sort out the mess that he's inherited. How we define and measure economic reality shapes the reality. Statistics are powerful and important things. And in fact, since the book came out, they literally have not been out of the headlines. Here are another couple of examples. In September 2014, the Office for National Statistics here added to the UK economy illegal drugs and prostitution. They did other things too. They changed the way that pensions are measured in GDP. They added research and development expenditures for the first time. And these were much bigger effects on GDP. £10 billion isn't very much in the context of a 1.7 trillion a year economy. But understandably, it was this part that grabbed the headlines. The reason was that the definition had changed. GDP is an international standard. It's agreed by a United Nations committee with economists and statisticians from many countries who take about 10 or 15 years to come up with a new GDP standard, and these get implemented from time to time at the international level, and then rolled out in different countries at their own pace. 2014 was the year that the European countries went ahead with this measure. And there is some logic to it. GDP is meant to measure economic activity in the market. There is a market for illegal drugs and prostitution. Although I don't actually know how the statisticians collect the figures, one can't imagine them going with their clipboards to our major railway stations and asking. But they find the figures somehow, and other European countries did the same. In fact, in some of them, like the Netherlands, some of these activities would be legal and not illegal. So there is some logic to including these marketed activities in a measure of marketed economic activity. But you can understand the reason for people raising their eyebrows about it, because we read all the time about how fast GDP is growing as a shorthand for how well is the economy doing. But is the economy really doing well if there are more illegal activities of this kind going on? You can understand the question. The other story here is about Nigeria's GDP, which at about the same time was what's called rebased. The composition of an economy changes over time. So if we're counting UK GDP today, we wouldn't want to give the manufacture of horse-drawn carriages the same weight it would have had in 1900. And the weights of adding things up in the economy changed to reflect that change in composition. The agencies in Africa don't have the resources and the experience to do that as frequently as it's done in Europe and the US. And in fact, in Nigeria, it hadn't been done since the 1960s, and the same was true of a number of other African economies as well. So they went through this exercise, and they discovered that actually the Nollywood film industry is quite important, and the mobile phone sector and all the services around that are quite important. And they added 89% to the level of GDP overnight. Now, of course, that didn't change anything real. Nobody in Nigeria was any better off as a result. But it did make Nigeria's GDP bigger than South Africa's and the biggest on the continent. And so maybe that kind of thing would have some consequences geopolitically in time, who can say. But the statistics are powerful, and I think there's a message in the very strong interest that people have in statistics at the moment, and thankfully in my book as well. One of the lessons of writing a history of GDP is the realization that it's not a natural object at all. It's an intellectual construct that changes over different historical periods. And before around the 1920s, nobody talked about the economy at all, or thought about adding it up in the quantitative way that we do now and take for granted. Of course, there was an economic domain. People talked about progress and understood that mills were important and trade was important, but they didn't have the term the economy, or indeed the term unemployment. And it was the catastrophe of the First World War and its aftermath economically, and then the Great Depression, that triggered an interest in having these aggregate statistics and being able to get your arms around how big the economy actually was. And I think that must partly reflect the scale of the catastrophe that was hitting the Western economies at the time, and also the expansion of the franchise, democracy, the fact that people, for the first time, expected the government to do something about this, because there had, after all, been vicious trade cycles in the Victorian era. And so the effort started, led here in Oxford by Colin Clark, and in the US by Simon Kuznets, who's often called the father of GDP. It's a bit ironic because the concept he had in mind was something very different from the GDP that we have now. Kuznets was very clear as he added up all the products and services being produced in the US economy. He was very clear that he was trying to measure economic welfare, the well-being of the people in some sense. So he would have deducted advertising. He thought that helped nobody. It made people buy things they didn't want. He would have deducted government spending because he thought spending on government was an intermediate product, a product that, an expense that you had to pay as the price of having a complex society that needed organising, but again, it wasn't contributing to final economic welfare. And this is a pretty active debate until the Second World War intervened, and Keynes famously, in a pamphlet called How to Pay for the War, complained that he didn't know what the aggregate productive capacity of the economy was. He couldn't tell how capable the country was of producing material to fight the war, and he didn't know how big the sacrifice consumers were going to have to make to divert resources to the war effort and not to consumption instead. So the concept that we have now that became the basis for the GDP measure that we use now was very different from the economic welfare measure that Kuznets envisaged, and it was also married to that very well-known Keynesian formula for consumer spending plus investment spending plus government plus net trade that anybody who's taken an introductory economics course will be familiar with. And so we ended up with not only a very different concept from the one that Kuznets had wanted, but also not even something that's the same way that we think about it now. Because another change, another politically driven change took place in the history of GDP, and that was the switch from looking at the level of economic activity, the level of employment, which Keynesian theory was concerned with, to paying attention to the growth of GDP. And this came about during the Cold War, and there was a clear switch in the language that people used to talk about the economy, from talking about levels to talking about economic growth. And that almost immediately raised objections, and ever since there have been the kind of objections that environmental campaigners have long made about focusing on economic growth and not the costs of economic growth. But that's still the one that we talk about all the time today, and every quarter, when the quarterly figures for GDP come out, we have headlines about whether it was a 0.2% increase or a 0.4% increase, and they get revised. And actually the message that this is a construct full of uncertainty and with debates about what you should include and what you should exclude gets lost in that kind of frequent media discussion. Actually, it's a really complicated thing to even collect the data. The GDP figures are based on dozens, possibly even hundreds of surveys. They come in at different times. Some of them are weekly, some of them are only annual, some of them are very seasonal. Something like a quarter of books are sold in the month before Christmas. Agricultural products are very seasonal as well. You have to adjust for that seasonality. We want to convert them from nominal pounds into real terms so that we understand what real progress is being made and what's just inflation. So it's a very complicated construct with a lot of uncertainty around it. And any quarterly number, like it's gone up by 0.2% this quarter, is well within the margin of error on the series. Something that too few people pay attention to. Some of the people who do pay attention to it, it's still in the headlines. I was delighted to find this headline about China. Their Statistics Bureau chief was detained last week, although not as perhaps he should have been for making up the GDP numbers. The Bank of England is one of the few people who pay attention to this uncertainty, and anybody who looks at their quarterly inflation report is going to be familiar with this chart. And normally the reporting concentrates on the forecast. I'm interested in the history. And you can see how much uncertainty they think there is about the history of GDP. The black line is the official Office for National Statistics data. And the green bands show, with decreasing amounts of certainty, where they think the actual GDP number lies. And they base these bands of uncertainty on past revisions and on the variability of the past GDP series. So if you look closely at the chart, you can see that at the moment, this is from the last inflation report, the Bank of England is saying that GDP growth is somewhere between about 0.5% and 5% a year. Now, that might not sound very much of a difference, but it's huge, actually, when you look at the compounding. 5% says living standards will double in about 14 years, and 0.5% that they'll double in about 140 years. Very big difference indeed. And that's the amount of uncertainty we have about the history, never mind about the future. So when people criticize economists for not being able to forecast, I draw some comfort from the fact that we don't even know what's gone on in the past. What I want to talk about really today is a new kind of uncertainty about the GDP figures, some new measurement problems that I touch on just towards the end of the book. And they arise from the way the economy is changing now, and particularly restructuring because of digital technologies. Now, this is particularly prominent in the policy debate at the moment because of this chart, which you might have seen in the papers. It shows labour productivity, real GDP per hour worked in the country from 1971 until 2014. And you'll see that mostly that follows a trend. It's about 2% a year until the financial crisis, and then it flatlines. And nobody is really sure why that flatlining is happening. And the government is very focused on fixing this problem and making sure that productivity starts to grow again. Because productivity is really what drives increases in living standards. It's why we have a material condition of life that is much higher than our parents' generation. It's why we have central heating, it's why we have mobile phones, it's all of the innovations, but it's also the ability to produce more with less inputs of resources. The fact that this is the policy preoccupation now, and this chart has become the obsession of the government, suggests to me, and it's not just the UK, by the way, it's other countries too, suggests to me that there's actually quite a deep uncertainty about, a deep anxiety about the future and what the economy holds for us. Has something broken, is what this chart says. And I think these questions are really quite profound, because we have an economy that doesn't have many products anymore. It's 80% services in the UK and a similar figure in other developed economies. What is productivity in an economy which is 80% based on services? One of the questions lying behind this dates back to a very famous paper by an economist called Will Baumol in the 1960s, and a phenomenon that's because of this called Baumol's cost disease. And he said, if you look at certain services, like a quartet, there's a limit to how much their productivity can increase, because you can't play a Beethoven quartet twice as fast to double your productivity. There are some inherent limits on certain kinds of services. Now, of course, you do get productivity gains because, for example, we had records, so people could hear the music if not live, and now digital downloads make that easier, so there is some productivity in the listening to music. But there are other services, and particularly caring for people who are ill or elderly or children, where there seem to be real limits on the even potential for productivity gains in that kind of service. And I think there's some of that anxiety about what does the future hold with an aging population, with a lot of services. What do we even mean by productivity? But the difficulties with the digital economy are actually even more fundamental than that, because we don't collect statistics on it. We collect statistics in something called the standard occupational categories and the standard industrial classification. And this is the result of an international standard-setting process under the United Nations, been going on since the 1940s, changes very infrequently. So there are lots and lots of categories for manufacturing. And here are the categories for painter. You can be a painter of landscapes, a painter of artificial flowers, a spray painter. In fact, there are several different kinds of spray painter. So you can put yourself in 50 different categories if your occupation is painter. If you're a search engine optimization person, or a writer of programs in Ruby on Rails, or you work in social media, or you do any number, big data, any number of new digital professions, it's really not obvious where you put yourself. So we don't know how many people there are doing these kinds of jobs or where they are. And similarly, the industrial classifications just don't encompass the new industries. So we're not measuring them. It's a pretty fundamental problem. We just don't know how big any of these things are. Some of them ought to be counted, but they're not because they're very small-scale businesses, and the machinery is set up for big companies doing surveys and providing the data. The ONS is only just starting to think about collecting in much more mechanized big data types of methods, or even joining up with other government databases like the tax records, so they don't even have that information ready to hand at the moment. But as I'm going to come on to say a bit later, even our ways of working are changing in ways that make it hard to think how you would map the economy now onto the kinds of categories we have at the moment. Everybody knows it's a problem. If you go to any of the exciting meetings I often do among statisticians, it's the first thing that gets discussed. It isn't an easy one to fix, though, partly because it requires international agreement, and partly because actually it's not even clear what the new categories would be. We don't know yet whether we will need a separate category for a Ruby on Rails programmer, or if that will be just a passing fad, and we need a much wider a category for programmers, or exactly what the standard is going to be. It isn't quite standardized yet. So that's a very basic problem. We're not counting lots of things that are happening in the digital economy. One has the impression they're growing quite fast, but we're not sure. There's also the business model problem. The business models are changing, and that's affecting GDP. So here's Blockbuster Video, closed down recently. Actually, there are lots of aspects of modern business models that don't get captured in the statistics. The price indices don't measure promotions, buy 2 for 3, buy one, get one for free. They don't measure those prices, any bundling or promotional pricing. They are not taking account of this dematerialization of lots of activities. There's been disintermediation in all kinds of sectors, people selling video games, people selling financial services in the high street, banks closing down branches, travel agencies, employment agencies. Lots of activities that used to have buildings in the high street have been closing down those buildings. So what's happening? Well, their cost of production is going down, they're becoming more efficient. The productivity of bricks is going up in some way. You get more travel agency services or video rental services for fewer bricks. Consumers are better off, they've got more choice. They don't have to spend time going to the high street. Some enjoy it, others don't. They're probably getting better prices than they used to when they had less choice. What's happening to GDP? Well, it's going down because investment in buildings is a component of gross domestic product. And if you look at this category, investment in buildings, for two of these sectors, retailing and finance, you can see that for retailing there's been a downward trend. This is real terms, a downward trend that's quite modest, and a very steep downward trend in finance as people move their banking online and bank branches have been closed down. These two categories now account for about 4% of total real terms investment in buildings, and it was 17% in 1997 at the start of this chart, so that's quite a big decrease just from the two categories. And investment in buildings is between 1/15 and 1/12 of GDP throughout this period. So it's not huge, but it's not nothing either, and it's just one example of a category of activity that, as it's being digitized and dematerialized, is coming out of GDP. Some of the reasons that digital activities are coming out of GDP ought not to make a difference, because we're still spending money, people are still making money and earning, and they're still spending money on consumer electronic goods, on electricity to power their consumer electronic goods, and so on. But it's likely that not all of it is being captured by existing surveys and methods of collecting the statistics, partly because it's smaller scale activity, partly because statisticians do things the way they always have and they haven't entirely modernized it yet. But it's also the case that, just as in the debate between Kuznets and Keynes, GDP isn't measuring economic welfare. It just isn't measuring all of the consumer benefits that are coming about through the new technologies. And it never has done. It never has measured the value of innovation. And that can be enormous. Here's an example. Here's a chap on the International Space Station. I've forgotten his name, it was last year. And his spanner broke. So the experiment that he was running had to be halted. And in the past, what would have happened is that they would have had to send a new rocket up to the International Space Station, and they would have waited until next time they were ready to change the astronaut shifts anyway, because it's pretty expensive to send a rocket up, costs tens of millions of dollars. So that would have been several weeks at least not running the experiment, plus the cost of the rocket. What they did instead was email the software to the International Space Station, and they've got a 3D printer on board now, so he just printed out his new spanner. Got it very quickly, very cheaply, didn't have to spend the tens of millions of dollars on sending up the rocket. So that is a kind of qualitative change in capabilities that isn't captured in GDP in any way. And if anything, it would have reduced GDP because it's one less rocket trip to the space station. And it's always been known that innovation just doesn't get reflected in GDP figures over time. This is part of the debate that's going on now about productivity. An economist called Robert Gordon has become very prominent for arguing that productivity has slowed down the way it has, as I showed you in that earlier chart, because all the potential for great innovations is already gone. In fact, he argues that most of them happened in the early 20th century. Things like public health that comes about through having plumbing, indoor plumbing, or the gains from infant mortality or from post-operative mortality through discovering antisepsis. Those were really big changes in human life, and they're not going to get repeated. And of course, it's true that the impacts of earlier innovations, be it in health or urbanization through transportation, you can't repeat the same things over again. And if you're looking for evidence about the pace of innovation, the price of products is a good place to look. So he might point to this kind of chart. This is a fabulous website called Our World in Data. This is a very long run of the price of lighting, price per million lumen hours, patching together different technologies of lighting. And you can see there was a great period of improvement in the late Middle Ages, 300 years of nothing much happening, and then another great period of progress in the 19th century, culminating in electrification. And once you've got electric light, you're not going to capture the benefits of being able to turn on, at the flick of a switch, a cheap source of lighting again, of course. So Gordon argues that there's nothing new to come that's as big, that's on the same scale as those past innovations. Well, it's certainly true that you couldn't have the same impacts. We can't urbanize again. We can't have those transformative impacts on infant mortality again. But other innovations actually are having even bigger declines in price at the moment. Here are two examples. The left-hand panel is computer processing power. And this isn't a linear scale like the previous chart, this is an exponential scale. So it reflects what's Moore's law, very well known, that the power of computers doubles approximately every 2 years, or equivalently the price halves in that same kind of period. And there's no sign of a slowdown in Moore's law to date. I think this chart finishes in about 2010. The right-hand chart comes from the National Institutes of Health in the US, and again, it's a logarithmic chart, and it shows that the price of sequencing a genome is falling even faster than the price of computer processing power, because they've put Moore's law on there for comparison. So this says that actually there are some very big innovations taking place, and of course we don't know what the economic and social impacts of those are going to be, but my guess is that they're going to be quite big. I'm not going to predict what they are, but I think they will be large. Can we ever capture those effects in statistics? Well, the statisticians try to a degree. They do something called hedonic pricing. If you buy a laptop now, it might cost the same as one you would have bought 2 or 3 years ago, but it will have much nicer features. It will have a better camera, more memory, be faster, bigger screen, clearer screen, or whatever. A computer would have cost you £6,000 in the late 1970s when this advert comes from, $6,000 rather, and you've got a whacking 10 megabytes for that. What they do is it's called hedonic pricing. You run a regression on the characteristics of computers. How much has the speed increased? How much has the memory increased? And you try to account for the quality improvements in the prices that you measure. And then that leaves you with, if there's anything left, some sort of pure inflation measure that you can use as part of your inflation index. It's hard to believe, though, that you can capture in that the quality changes from being able to do as we can now, go online, do all that banking and travel agency very quickly, do all the things that we've become habituated to doing, all the ways that cheap, fast computer processing power is affecting our lives, compared to the $6,000 for the 10 megabit computer. I particularly love this line, thinking ahead for the 1980s. One of the great historians of national income accounting, Paul Studensky, who wrote a book in 1958, in fact said as much: comparisons of the national incomes of a different country during widely separated periods deal essentially with different societies, and it's very hard to make that society to society change. Using these techniques also leaves us with just quite a baroque structure. It's very hard to understand what the statistics are really telling you if you look at a price index and you know that several of the components of that price index have had this hedonic pricing technique applied to them. And it's become actually very contentious. People fight a lot about what inflation really is. Now, the digital industry is really certain that its contribution to economic well-being and growth is not being captured in the figures. And part of that is exactly because of these rapid price falls, because if you look at the share of any sector in the economy in nominal GDP, which is how these comparisons tend to be done, when the price is falling rapidly, then that nominal headline figure is growing very slowly. So if you look at the contribution of information and communication technology to the US economy in their figures, it looks like it hasn't gone up at all in 25 years, and there's something slightly absurd about that. And it's reflecting falling prices. And in fact, as we know, there are a lot of zero-price goods in the online world. Here are some of them. There's the Linux Penguin, lots of free software online, Wikipedia that lots of people use, including too many students, fantastic public resources. The Public Library in New York just put on a vast database of images that this is taken from. Now, really, you want to deduct from this, I'm with Kuznets, you want to deduct from this the penalty consumers pay for watching adverts when they're online. And in fact, some of them will now pay real money not to watch adverts online. Even though taking off that implicit cost of advertising, there are lots of free digital goods that people are just providing out of the goodness of their hearts. I don't know why people do Linux programming online and make it available to people like me. It's a genuinely voluntary, genuinely valuable output. And this means that there's a blurring of boundaries between what's in the economy and what's not in the economy, and people's way of working is changing greatly. So here's somebody who's, I believe, called a vlogger. This is something that young people do. And she's a fashion vlogger, or maybe it's makeup, beauty, but she sits in her room and she talks about the clothes and makeup that she buys, and she puts it on YouTube. If you're successful enough, you can make an income out of it, because YouTube serves ads around the videos, and you get some income from that. People get asked to endorse products and write books and go on the celebrity circuit. And there are lots of people on this spectrum, from doing it as a hobby in their spare time to becoming a professional vlogger. There are people in what's called the sharing economy, doing a little bit of renting out a room through Airbnb, renting out their driveway to a commuter who wants to park their car during the day, doing holiday swaps, selling handicrafts on websites like Etsy or through eBay, going around their house getting second-hand stuff and selling it on Marketplace. None of that data is being collected. The surveys simply aren't capturing it. And if you look at industry figures, it looks like about 1 million people are doing some degree of professional activity, part-time or full-time, through these new sorts of activities. And many millions are using them as consumers. These prices aren't collected at all and put in the consumer price inflation basket, because the ONS reasons that this is like selling second-hand goods. It's just a bit of the economy that doesn't concern them, because it's outside what's called the production boundary. And the boundary is what separates what's in GDP from what's outside GDP. And one of the most famous things that's outside GDP is housework. Clearly, this is how we all dress to do our housework. It's called household production, formally, And some bits of it are in and some bits of it are out. And here's the distinction. If you make a product, like a jar of jam from your garden, and you sell it, in principle, that's in GDP because there's a product. And that's because the standard applies to all countries in the world, and developing countries have much more home production for consumption at home or for sale in the marketplace than we do in the West. A lot of people will grow food on small holdings, make their own clothes, and so on. So they wanted to include all that in GDP. They exclude services. They exclude washing up, cleaning, cooking meals, but also services like volunteering in your local charity shop or volunteering to read at school. So lots of voluntary activities are outside GDP. Now, this was an active debate in the 1930s and 40s, and many people thought that housework ought to be included, but actually it was too hard to collect the figures, and there were not enough comparisons in the market to enable you to put a price on those activities. Now, of course, it's very easy to buy meals outside the home or to buy a cleaner to come and do your cleaning for you. There are lots of market comparators that would enable you to price it. And we perhaps even have better ways of surveying. The Internet of Things must be useful for something. Perhaps we could capture better data on how people are using their time and how much time they're spending doing these various activities. But I think this boundary is getting quite blurred because of different ways of working in the digital economy and because of the sharing economy and how quickly that's growing, and because of all the voluntary activity that's happening online. It probably doesn't add up to a very large amount yet, but it is growing rapidly, and it's becoming quite important. And there's some really important choices that people make about these kinds of activities, especially as the population gets older. A lot of people have aging parents who will need caring for, and we're going to have to decide, will we buy caring activity for them, which is largely what happens now, or will people increasingly take that burden back into the family, as used to be the case some decades ago? Or will we find a way of substituting capital for labour instead and invent domestic robots? And that's an open question, and actually we don't have the information that we'd need really to inform policy decisions about how to shape that kind of world. Or even to think about what productivity actually means in this kind of economy. And it seems to me that it's as now partly about how much labour and capital do you throw at the economy to make it grow, and how efficiently are they used, and labour productivity depends on having capital to work with. It depends on the quality of the outcome in services, even more than in products. And it seems to me it also depends on time spent in a way that we haven't thought about very much in the past. An ATM is an example of an innovation in a service that did increase productivity because it saved banks money, although they employed their humans to do other kinds of work instead, and not all of it good. It also saved their customers time, so it was a genuine consumer-facing productivity improvement. Think about those machines we're getting now in supermarkets that you swear at when they say unexpected item in the bagging area. Now, they look like they might be something like an ATM, but they're not really, because they're just substituting the time spent from the shop to the consumer, and we're spending just as much time as the people at the checkouts, probably more in my case, on taking our shopping and paying for it. So I think we need to think much more about how we think about productivity in this economy, but also about whether or not that wedge between GDP and economic welfare is growing or not. I talked earlier about, are the innovations getting any faster? We don't know, and we don't know what their impact will be. But in the sharing economy, there's a lot of stuff that's just not getting captured. So here's a little schematic to try and explain it. The top panel shows you what happens to GDP when you go on holiday. You buy the holiday, and some money goes to the travel agency or the hotel, and some money goes to the airline. And there's revenue that's counted in GDP. Suppose you do a home swap instead. So you go and stay in the Lake District in a nice cottage, and they come for a nice weekend in Oxford. So you swapped your home, you've not spent any money on accommodation, and the hotel there has less revenue. Now you have money spare, which you might well spend on other products that get counted in GDP. So this might or might not affect measured GDP. But there's also that holiday accommodation you have that's not getting counted anywhere. Again, we don't know how big this is. millions and millions of people are doing it, and to judge from the angst of French hoteliers and taxi drivers, it's actually quite a big deal. Something that we need to think about and measure. And also, should we be trying to measure that kind of welfare or not? Is this concept good for the structure of the economy that is emerging now? I've been thinking about digital change since the mid-1990s. I was a reporter at the time on the Independent newspaper, and they sent me to a presentation in the Savoy Hotel by a company that was about to float on the stock market. It was the first internet service provider, and it had set up a webcam on the Golden Gate Bridge, and I think this was 1992. And I was completely bowled over by this new technology and was sure it was going to transform everything, which many economists didn't believe for a very long time. And I started rooting around. And even in the 1990s, there was something very odd happening to the economy in the statistics. This is the UK since 1990. The top line shows the real GDP figures published by the Office of National Statistics, and the bottom line is something called total material requirement. Now, this isn't our footprint. It isn't our material footprint on the planet because it doesn't include trade, and we're net importers of goods. So that's a big thing to leave out. But what it does tell you about is the structure of production in the UK economy and how much that has dematerialized, how intangible that's become. And more than all of the gain in GDP since 1990, in fact, going back into the 1980s, has come about through these intangible activities. And it's really quite striking. So we are, I think, back to the future. And I started out by talking about the debate between Simon Kuznets on the left and Keynes on the right. The GDP that we have, it co-evolved with Keynesian macroeconomics and the preoccupation with managing the level of aggregate demand in the economy, first of all for wartime, and then later for the level of employment during peacetime. And it's a good tool for that, and I think central banks and finance ministries, treasuries will always want something like that as a tool for understanding what's happening in the macroeconomy. But it's flawed in lots of ways, and the kinds of ways that Kuznets talked about in that original debate. And I've really just been focusing on the kinds of flaws that come about because the structure of the economy is changing, and we are having to rethink the contribution to economic welfare coming from these new kinds of activities. But there are others as well, and in particular one I haven't mentioned is sustainability, the environmental impact of economic growth. How do we think about factoring the future into how we measure the economy? How do we have a measure of assets? There are some partial balance sheets for the economy, but they're very partial. And in GDP, we don't even care whether something is a pound of consumer spending or a pound of investment spending that will produce a future return. GDP counts them both equally. So that's another huge area that we need to think about. We have national economic statistics in a globalized world, and I think the a debate about taxation of multinationals is just lifting a corner of all the issues, on all the issues that are related to how do we measure economic activity when actually it's not national anymore? Should we be thinking much more about cities and regions and about global measures of activity as well? But this really matters because this is part of the political debate. Statistics are powerful. I've got a couple of headlines here that were both published on the same day during the election campaign, the morning after the quarterly GDP growth figures were published. And they're two very different interpretations of the same number that I think was 0.2. Telegraph, UK economy grew at fastest rate for 9 years in 2014. Guardian, living standards, UK election data shows slowest recovery since the 1920s. And it's not even that you can interpret the same number in such different ways. It's actually that the number changes so much. The triple-dip recession that got revised away, the 1970s public finance and balance of payments crisis that got revised away. If you look at today's data for the late 1970s, when Dennis Healey had to go and ask the IMF for money, it's not there. It's gone from the figures. How would political history have turned out differently if we had not been focused on statistics in the way that we do? So they're very powerful. We need to treat them with much more caution than we do. And I've just talked about one aspect of it today that I've been working on for a very long time, but I think there's some very big questions about statistics. We're in the middle of a process now of discussing it in the UK and elsewhere, the digital industry, the debate about sustainability, all coming together into, I think, a moment of opportunity for rethinking how we think about the economy. And I'm very keen to hear what you all have to say about it. Thank you very much.
Diane, thanks so much for a very, very clear exposition, which I hope convinced those of you that didn't think this was important before that it is, and help those of you that know it's important understand some of the subtleties and the longer term context. So we have lots of people, I'm sure, who want to ask questions. Let me start with David Henry, who used to be the head of the economics department and the president of the Econometric Association and various other things. Well qualified to ask the first question.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for coming and giving us the talk. First of all, you said yourself earlier on exactly the reason why all these past statistics were so heavily revised, and it was the changes in the price indexes. I mean, the actual numbers, if you look at the nominals, don't actually change. So, for example, in 1968, quarter 1 and 2, huge switch between the quarters because of the changes in purchase tax are no longer there in the real data, because people bought commodities whose price fell in relative terms, but they're still there in the nominal data. So there are lots of problems like that. But the one, the first ever estimates of GNP was away with the Doomsday Book, and were followed up quite well in the 16th century by Edmund Halley and others. So we do actually have intermittent statistics, and now Steve Brodbury has produced these long-run statistics in his 10-year research program in the history of the UK. So we have all the data for very long runs to look at. And I think the key thing I would worry about in your talk is you didn't talk about taxation. I think you're quite right about the digital economy. We're hugely underestimating it. Many of the prices of things have gone to near zero, but they're not taxable. And those statistics reflect a real problem for central governments unless they think very differently about how we can raise taxation to fund the very activities that most of us think should be undertaken by the state.
I think it's one of the things that's most likely to drive change in thinking about the economy and how we measure it. I did actually look at the Doomsday Book recently, because you can look at it online, of course. And it's a very interesting mix of different kinds of statistics. And one of the things it very clearly did was measure assets as well as the income that people would get from the assets that they held. And assets are a much more important part of measurement of the economy all the way through up until the 20th century. And that's because you can tax the trees. It's much easier to tax physical things like that. I don't have the answer to the tax problem at all. And ultimately, it's people who pay taxes. So looking at people and the flows of resources that they command may be the route that governments have to go down.
And the other part of that is jurisdiction. Where is it if it's digital?
Yeah. Well, if you rent someone else's house in a switch, who pays tax?
Maybe just identify yourself.
I'm sure you're familiar with this wonderful speech by Bobby Kennedy, in which he criticizes GDP. And one of the things he says is, well, it measures our expenditure on tear gas, and it doesn't capture the quality of our poetry or the strength of our marriages. And it's a wonderful speech, but it always struck me that nobody ever bought tear gas in order to boost GDP, and nobody ever got divorced only because it didn't help GDP, and they would have stayed together if it helped GDP. So my question is, you've identified lots of problems in the way that we measure GDP and lots of ways in which it departs from Kuznets's vision of a measurement of economic welfare. But in what way does this lead to us making worse decisions? And if we were able to improve our measurement of economic welfare, what better decisions might we make?
You certainly don't want economists measuring the quality of poetry. One example of the way it distorts policy, I think, is the finance sector. And even now, I think politicians believe that there's a limit to what they can do to the finance sector, how they can regulate it, how they could tax it, because it contributes so much to GDP. That definition has changed frequently. It was most contentious to start with. It's the most frequently revised in definitions in different GDP standards. Every revision increased the apparent size of the financial sector. The last one was financial intermediation services indirectly measured to deal with the fact that a lot of financial services don't have a price. You've got a trading activity where the money that you make comes from the spread between interest rates, but there's no actual fee. So an insurance premium, you can count that. How do you measure the financial activity from trading? And the answer they came up with at the time was to look at the difference between some kind of safe interest rate and the rates that financial services companies were transacting at in their trading activities. So essentially what they were doing was measuring risk-taking and adding that to GDP. So that's kind of absurd, because we take risks all the time. When you buy a house or choose what career to take, you're taking a risk. We don't think that ought to be in GDP. And I think it's now widely believed that FISM was a mistake. And Charlie Bean's interim report on modernising economic statistics flagged that. It's going to take 20 years to get it out of the figures. But it makes financial services look a much bigger sector in GDP. This is why the digital sector wants to be counted, because it increases their lobbying power, frankly. And there are real consequences of how you measure economic activity. I don't think we can easily switch. I don't have, here's an all-singing and all-dancing welfare measure that's better. But we just need to be much more careful about how the GDP figures are used.
Just identify yourself.
Right, I'm Max Rosa. I work here as an economist at the university.
Max Rosa,
we managed to recruit him into Oxford Modern School.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, thanks for the talk. You were starting with this old debate between measuring welfare directly and measuring economic output. And I guess a lot of these issues that you brought up about the digital economy are about measuring welfare to measure the economic output in a way. So I was wondering about your recommendations for the future. Do you think the way forward is to get the GDP figures right and to get the price indices right? Or is the way forward maybe an alternative in measuring welfare directly? And I guess since you probably defend GDP, why?
I don't think we have a good alternative yet. If you believe in managing the macroeconomy at all, you need something. Although it does alarm me that so much depends on the gap between GDP, which is a construct, and potential GDP, which is an even stranger construct. One thing I think we definitely need to do is have some measure of assets. How much are we eating tomorrow's capital to have the flow of income and resources that we're consuming today? And that includes natural capital, but also public infrastructure. How much are we investing in human capital? I think that's very important and an easy thing to add to our array of measures that we look at. There are lots and lots of alternatives, and dashboards have become very popular. The Stiglitz and Sen Commission in 2009 recommended a dashboard. The trouble I have with them is that people put into them anything that they care about, and there's a proliferation of dashboards, and some of them have 54 or 100 different indicators in, and that can't be part of the public policy dialogue because nobody's going to pay attention. You need something that's clear enough and concise enough that it's part of that public debate in a democracy, and these statistics are a public good. It's about being an informed citizenry. So I don't have a good answer, and maybe one could look at empirical evidence about which 6 things really matter to people and look at those. Commuting times, quality of the local environment, unemployment levels. No, there are a few things for which there's good empirical evidence. But that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer to your question.
Great. Let's just work our way back.
Thanks. I'm Dominic Burbage, Politics and African Studies. I just had a question on the internet. You mentioned that it's a cost to consumers because of the advertising, and then you use Kuznets to back up that that's a problem for the way we measure GDP. But I was just wondering what you think about the use of making money through the internet through just getting more information that is sort of changing advertising itself such that it's not normally a cost. So Google can track where I go, Facebook can see what I like, and that helps marketing, which enhances the goods that are produced for me. It doesn't in any way inhibit what I would be doing anyway. So is that a good we put in GDP, or is it a cost we take away from people's well-being?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and people who've looked at advertising have always distinguished between information, the provision of information which is useful, and the kind of marketing the madman kind of marketing that makes you buy things that you wouldn't otherwise have thought of. And maybe some of that's useful too, because who would have known that they needed a smartphone if people hadn't marketed it once they invented made the innovation? So I think it's quite a complicated question. The other thing that I've tried to think about is that when people started buying goods online, it was pretty clear that their choice exploded and that the prices converged and fell. So there was a real efficiency gain, and as a consumer, you got a much better deal. There's now so much more personalization that I think there's starting to emerge evidence that people who market things online are able to price discriminate much better and are capturing back some of that consumer welfare that came about in the first place. But we don't know, because this is private information held by the companies. And one of the things I think is quite important in this new world of statistics will be to have some kind of legal framework for official statisticians to get access to data. Because at the moment it's proprietary, companies don't give it out very easily, and if they expect contracts to be upheld in courts of law, if they expect favourable tax deals, then the quid pro quo is that they hand over their data.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Good evening, thank you. I'm Dominic Shadbolt, I'm a history undergraduate. You made an interesting remark about why on earth would people invest their time in Linux. I think it's because they value what they get from it in a different way that can't be measured. It's very subjective. They're in a very tight community, and they essentially applaud one another's work when people do good, clever things, and that to them brings value and worth. But I don't think that can be measured or put into GDP, but for them it's something. Having had this explained to me by a Linux programmer the other day, that's why. That was all.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I have neither the talent nor the public spiritedness to have done that kind of thing myself. And I think it goes back to some of the debates that I understand sociologists have about the gift economy and a completely different economic structure. There is one thing that you can measure about that kind of activity, perhaps, and that's how much time people spend doing it. So I'm quite interested in the time that people spend doing things as a way of getting a handle on these kinds of activities.
Yeah, when
Yes.
our citizen science projects like the Zooniverse and others, people spending massive amount of time doing those public spirited projects. Yeah.
I'm Mark Damazer. I was a journalist once, and I'm here now. Start with a question and work back from it. Am I wrong to think that Germany is a more prosperous country than the United Kingdom? Not only because of total GDP, but GDP per head. So I'll try and work that through. I thought it was a riveting talk and extremely challenging about a single country's GDP and its components and the extent to which we overestimate some things, underestimate other things. But if I try and do this in a geopolitical or even journalistic way and look at the main narrative over the last 40 or 50 years, I'm not wrong in thinking that Germany is actually an economic success story. And the way that I think that is the case is not because I've been on the German transport system, because I'm aware of how dangerous anecdotage can be, but because essentially I derive that from my understanding of German GDP. And in fact, I'm intrigued in the British political debate about the extent to which the British public is not all that well informed about other people's GDP. And if they were, we might have a more realistic debate about our place in the world and I don't want to say Europe in particular, but certainly in Europe. If people knew that the French economy, which we consider in a journalistic way to be full of structural unemployment and rigidities and a poor labour market and something of a basket case, but if we actually all understood that the productivity obsession which you put up there, if it were applied in a British versus French comparison, would actually show you that the French economy was considerably more productive than the British, it might give a different reflection on the way that we reported these things. So the question is that these broad truths, vulgar and imperfect as they are, may very well be right. China has obviously grown at some phenomenal rate. Germany has, on the whole, grown faster than we have. The French are, on the whole, more productive than we are. So for all their imperfections, it's not only that it's the only tool that we've got, it can actually be quite useful if understood properly.
That's also affectionate about GDP. That's the book.
Yes. I'd be a little bit more cautious about the inter-country comparisons that you're making, because I think the margins of uncertainty are large enough that if you look at most OECD countries, they're really quite similar to each other. The US is clearly more productive than the others. I'd be less confident about other comparisons. But you're right to say that if you look at the long-run sweep of history, the kind of figures that David was talking about at the start, they do tell you the story of very little, very slow improvements in prosperity for a very long time, and then a sharp acceleration. So it's what people call the hockey stick of history. It's drawn by the GDP chart, and it does tell you something. That's certainly very true. But let me ask you to consider Greece and Portugal now, whose GDP per capita is very similar. And Portugal has suffered in the financial crisis and has had pretty flat GDP for a number of years. Greece had a very sharp increase in GDP and rapid growth, and a very sharp decline in GDP to come back to the same level. Which of those two countries is better off? And the conventional answer would be that in between, Greece had all that extra GDP in that gap between their growth and decline, whereas Portugal just chugged along. I'm not sure that's how it feels to the Greeks at the moment, even though Portugal's still in a pretty rough place. So the psychology of how we think about how the economy is doing is quite interesting, and it did make the switch from living standard level, to being focused on growth. And actually there are different obsessions over time as well, and it was balanced payments in the 70s, it was understandably unemployment in the 80s and 90s, so that focus changes. Productivity is what it is at the moment, but when events change, that will change again.
David, I'll come back to you. If you want to add on this one? Yeah, all right, just give the mic to David briefly, and then we will get to you back.
I think also it's crucial whether you're measuring productivity per hour in the way that was in Diane's chart, or productivity per year per person, because they're very different in the different countries. And in fact, in Britain, in 2007, productivity per person per year in dollar terms exceeded productivity per person per year in dollar terms in the US for the first time since 1860. Right? And of course, that's a lot to do with the dollar. But it was a huge shift. If you did that any other time in history, we were often 40% of the US. And that has been a massive change in output per year, but not in output per hour.
That's a great fact. It'll be in my
so
next talk.
And that's an hour's work story, is it?
That's an hour's work story. That's actually the Industrial Revolution was an hour's work story.
And unemployment, presumably, is the other part of the story in the US. And that makes a big difference. Yep.
Hi, I'm Justin Bowles. I'm a blogger, amongst other things, at Risk and Wellbeing. The secular stagnation argument is obviously doing the rounds with Larry Summers and high-profile people. And their opponents, which I presume include yourself, who say, well, you're just missing all this great stuff going on in the digital economy, and if we adjusted for that, the secular stagnation would disappear. But if that argument is correct, then why are we seeing these populist movements and this discontent in the States and people like Trump? If the secular stagnation is a mirage, why is there so much discontent out there?
I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a mirage. There are different elements to the secular stagnation story. One of them is about financial conditions and aggregate demand, and we've had a really serious financial crisis and its aftermath. There are what Gordon calls in his book the headwinds, which include the aging populations, and I'm sure that's making a difference to potential growth. So I think that there are different parts to that story. I think digital is growing very rapidly. I don't think we have any idea really of what difference that would make if you added it to the GDP measure. I've got no idea of what scale of difference it would make if you could find some way of adding it, although I think it's growing very rapidly. The thing that I find difficult in Gordon's argument is that he changes his territory for debate, looking between the past and the future. And when he's talking about the past, he is very clear that he's talking about consumer welfare, consumer surplus in economist terms, that would never have been captured in the definition of GDP, and about qualitative changes in life, the impact on health, and so on. When he talks about the future, he turns it to a story about GDP and how slowly GDP is growing. And I think you ought to have the debate on the same territory in both the past and the future. And as I said in the talk, we just don't know what the impacts of new technologies will be. If we could have a clean energy technology that would make it possible to have the same lighting and transportation, but with no carbon emissions, I would call that a big deal. And we don't know that. But these comparisons over time, I think people don't quite understand what the figures say, and it goes back to David's point about what price indices tell you. So if I told you that real GDP per capita is, I don't know, £27,000 now, and in 1900, I don't know what the exact figure was, but say it was 12,000, many people would think that would be like having £12,000 to spend now. But what it actually tells you is that it's like having £12,000 now to spend on products that were available in 1900 and not anything that's been invented ever since. So those sorts of long-term comparisons are just extremely tricky to make. On secular stagnation, I'm agnostic really. I don't know what our potential growth rate is.
True economist. The person in the back there.
Thank you, Professor, for this inspiring presentation. I'm a diffuse student here. I'm from Brazil. I would like to make one comment and one question. You certainly talk about GDP. GDP is a measure of flow, but there is a lot of discussion about measuring assets, in this case is wealth. And we have certainly a lot of problem in measuring wealth and distribution of wealth. So income that is actually measured by GDP is a result of wealth and wealth creation. So my question to you will be actually two. Do we need a better theory in terms of economic science, or we need better tool for empirical research? This is one question. And the second question is this. If you look for the 5 major primary resources that we have on Earth, that is population, energy, land, water. How do you think developed countries will tackle the problem of a population aging? Because you just mentioned we are an economy based on service, and certainly we're going to have a problem with labor in the coming years, especially in case of Brazil. Population is aging very fast. What will happen to productivity if we have to pay more for skills?
Gosh, there's a lot there. The answer to your first question is yes to both parts. We need both. I do think we will not get a new understanding of measuring the economy until we have some new theory, because what we have is based on the theoretical construct that Keynes put in place, and I'm not going to be the person who develops that. We do need those measures. As I said before, I absolutely think we need to measure wealth to understand the asset base on which our income flow is based, and we're not doing that at all well anywhere, although people are starting to make progress on that. I think it's really fundamental, actually, for environmental sustainability, because in democracies, that's the kind of conversation that people have. Politicians are held to account by a number. That number has to be something that takes account of the depletion of assets or the effect that we're having on the climate. Aging, I think, is a very interesting question, because I can't think of examples of countries that have had declining populations that have grown rapidly in real per capita terms. And modern economic growth theory actually quietly depends quite a lot on the number of people, because growth is thought to come from ideas, the transfer of knowledge or education. That's all attached to people. So I think we're kind of going into unknown territory economically with aging and declining populations. And there are people who say, well, that's fine, you get the productivity gain from investing in machines and the robots will do it instead. I think that remains to be seen. I just don't know. Japan is investing massively in robots. I don't know if that will help them escape from having to import human labour at some stage to look after the ageing population. I should also mention inequality, actually, in the context of the previous question, why people unhappy. And it's partly because they care about the environment and we're not measuring it, but it's partly because of inequality as well. And the basic welfare economics says that you can't measure the size of economic welfare without taking account of the distribution. So we slide between treating GDP as a number that's just measuring activity and it's value-free, and saying it's something that's measuring progress or welfare. You can't talk about the welfare without implicitly talking about the distribution as well. And that, I think, is clearly why we've got to the anger that you talked about.
It's a fascinating question. I mean, there are a number of Southeast Asian countries where you have declining population and rapidly growing productivity. But an interesting question is why. The gentleman at the back there.
A researcher in computer science, but in human aspects of computer science, so human-centered computing. And actually, you've just touched on the question I was going to raise, which is to do with robots and robotization. Because so far, when we think about digitization, it's been disintermediation and dematerialization, but things, generally speaking, that were fairly easy to dematerialize, like books or music, or going into a shop and doing for yourself something which previously a cashier would have done for you, or something like this. There are those who say that something like 40% of US jobs potentially could be robotized or digitized in some way or another. So this will, it seems to me, take the whole thing into a completely different order of magnitude. There are those also who say, well, that's essentially a switch from labor into capital, but there's absolutely no reason why you should imagine that the cost of a robot or running a robot will in any way be comparable to the cost of labor, or indeed the terms of the numbers of robots you'll need would be in any way comparable to the number of people that you will need, that you currently need. So I was wondering if you've got any thoughts about how this is going to be measured in the forthcoming GDP.
That number of 40% actually was created above my head, over here, by Carl Frey, who's sitting up there. 47% of US jobs lost to machine intelligence over the next 20 years is the number which is on our website.
I was very pleased when I looked at the list to discover that economists were among the least likely to be digitized, actually. So that's okay. I don't know how quickly that will happen. There's quite a lot of infrastructure that goes around some of these bits of automation, and actually even automated cars, including the soft infrastructure of the legal framework for them. So it might be slower than people fear. And we've had episodes in the past of very, very dramatic shifts in the jobs that people do because of automation, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the period of automation in the 1980s and 1990s, millions of people. Now that's not very encouraging in the sense that we dealt with it very badly, and the people who were affected, we had no policies to help them cope with it. And so I think there's a really urgent need to think about what would do that. Would it be a basic citizen income? Would it be a different structure of social security and pensions that gave them more flexibility or some retraining? So we need to address those questions pretty quickly. But I don't think it will happen as fast as some of the worst case pictures. And I do think there will be other activities. There's a really interesting book by somebody called James Besson that looks at the Industrial Revolution, the cotton industry in particular, and the same pattern that we see now of a very big increase in the wages for the very small number of people who started out being able to work the new machines, because they were quite sophisticated skills. You had to be able to improvise, understand really well how they worked to make them, fix them when they mended, and the machines weren't very standardized and the tasks weren't at all standard. And very few people had those skills. But as the machines became mass-produced themselves and more standardized, and as the workforce became trained to use them, then the employment numbers went up and the wages for all of those workers went up as well. And I think there's just going to be quite a complex picture of how things move. So it's great to have those scenarios in mind, because that's what will focus people on adjusting the policy framework to make it possible for people to cope if they lose their jobs. But I'm less pessimistic about how quickly it will happen. And actually, if it does happen, that'd be great for the productivity figures, actually.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last question, unless I see anyone with a burning one. Over here.
Hello, my name is Jorge. I'm actually studying theology, but previously I was in industry, and I guess I have a question regarding the productivity number in terms of time, how it gets measured in time. And I guess the context in which I'm framing it is, I used to put a lot of hours outside of the time in the company doing work, and is that captured anywhere in GDP as in when we measure productivity, whether people are actually working longer hours because of the new technologies that make it accessible for them to do that?
The figures ought to capture, you can put the figures in terms of output per person per hour. So you can, in theory, capture that. It depends really whether that work's being recorded anywhere or the income's being recorded anywhere. And I'm not going to ask you about your tax affairs, but quite a lot of people who do work on the side would not declare that. So in principle, it ought to be counted in one measure of GDP. In practice, it might not be. And that's one of the aspects of the digital change, that a lot of it's very small scale. If somebody is making handicrafts in her spare time at home, she might not even know that if she makes income, she ought to declare it to somebody. In fact, it wasn't always easy to collect the statistics in the old economy. I was giving a talk to a group of citizens of Manchester who some of our students had brought in for a conference, and showed them the 80-page press release that comes with the national accounts each quarter, and was talking about how complicated it was, and you collect the data by surveys. And a gentleman sitting in the front row put his hand up and said, I used to work at ICI, and it was my job to fill out the form that came from the Office for National Statistics. I couldn't be bothered with that, he said. So I looked at what somebody put in last time, and I just added a bit.
It's a very good point to it. Would you have a seat? Just before I thank Diane for a fabulous lecture, and I thought such a full and generous response to a very complex set of questions. Let me just talk a little bit about some of the forthcoming things which are here. We have a seminar series at the moment which is focusing on technology and society. And this Thursday at 5 o'clock, we have Mind Machines, The Promise and Problems of Cognitive Enhancement Devices by Professor Roy Kadosh and Hannah Maslin. The following Thursday, the 11th, we have something on the dawn of quantum technology, which will focus on what quantum can do and when, by Professor Simon Benjamin, who's in our Oxford Martin program on bio-inspired quantum technologies. And then on the 18th of February, we have Michael Osborne, who's the co-director with Carl Frey of our project on technology and work that came up with that 47% of US workers are going to be threatened. He's talking on algorithms amongst us, machine learning, and society. Our special lecture for Women's Day on the 2nd of March is Professor Judy Wiseman, who's going to talk about automation, robotics, and the promise of an easier life. And she's particularly going to focus on whether robots will have gender implications in various ways, which I think is an absolutely fascinating and hitherto neglected topic. So those are just four of the many, many things that are happening. Do look at our website, which is always full of events that you can participate in, and we also encourage you to participate online. If you've been watching this lecture online, thank you for doing so. You won't, however, be able to benefit from buying this excellent book. You are all invited, or having a drink with us, you are all invited to a reception which will take place just around the corner here in our Illy Cafe. This book is at a very low price, which is going to reduce GDP. But if you buy lots of copies of it, GDP will go up. So I encourage you to do that. Please join me in thanking Diane for a fabulous lecture and response, and thank you for all coming.